What if I told you that some of the most powerful companies in the world have never once said sorry? Not because they had nothing to apologize for, but because admitting they were wrong would cost them everything. And they knew it. Think about the last time a company genuinely let you down. Maybe a product failed. Maybe you were treated badly. Maybe they made a decision that hurt thousands of people. And when you waited for them to own it, all you got was silence or spin. That silence is not an accident. It is a strategy, and it runs so deep inside certain organizations that it stops being a policy and becomes a personality. Today we are going to pull back the curtain on exactly why that happens and what it reveals about corporate psychology. There is a concept in psychology called organizational defensive routines. It was identified by a researcher named Chris Argyris, who spent decades studying how companies behave under pressure. What he found was disturbing. The smarter and more successful a company became, the harder it became for them to admit mistakes. High-performing organizations developed invisible rules about what could and could not be said out loud. Mistakes were real, but they were never named directly. Instead, they got buried under reports, reframes, and carefully chosen language that made failure sound like a strategic pivot. Now, you might think that sounds like a few bad apples making bad choices. But here is the thing. It was never about individual people. The individuals inside these companies were often smart, ethical, and self-aware, and yet the company as a whole consistently behaved as if it could do no wrong. This is one of the most fascinating things about collective psychology. A group of reasonable people can come together and produce an unreasonable institution. Each person protects the whole. Each department protects the brand. And before long, admitting error feels not just uncomfortable, but genuinely threatening to everyone involved. To understand this fully, we need to talk about something called institutional identity. Just like humans, companies develop a sense of self. They have values on paper, a story they tell the world, and an internal belief about who they are. And just like humans, they will fight to protect that identity. When a company makes a serious mistake, that mistake is not just a problem to fix. It is a threat to the story. It contradicts the image. It makes the brand look fragile. And so the psychological machinery of the company kicks in, not to fix the problem, but to protect the story. Here is where it gets really interesting. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance reduction. When reality conflicts with self-image, the mind works hard to close the gap. And usually it does not do that by changing the self-image. It does it by reinterpreting reality. Companies do this constantly, and most of the time nobody even notices. You have seen this play out in real life more times than you can count. A product harms someone. The company says the product was used incorrectly. A policy hurts workers. The company says the policy was misunderstood. An executive behaves badly. The company says the matter has been resolved internally. Every single time, the story stays intact. But why does this work? Why do companies get away with it? The answer brings us to a concept called asymmetric accountability. Companies have enormous resources to shape narratives. They have PR teams, legal departments, communications experts, and advertising budgets. The individual harmed has none of that. And so the company version of events almost always wins. This is not conspiracy. It is system design. Over decades, companies have learned exactly how much they need to say to make a controversy disappear without ever crossing into genuine accountability. The formula is precise. Express concern. Do not assign blame. Announce a review. And then wait for the news cycle to move on. There is a name for the kind of statement companies release in these moments. Crisis communications professionals call it a non-apology apology. You have definitely heard one before. It usually sounds like this. We are sorry that some customers felt disappointed by their experience. Notice what is missing. There is no acknowledgement of what actually went wrong. The non-apology is a masterpiece of psychological engineering. It mimics the emotional shape of an apology without the legal or moral weight of one. It lets the company feel like they addressed the situation while ensuring no admission of wrongdoing ever enters the record. It is carefully designed to close the emotional chapter without opening a legal one. And here is the brutal truth about why it keeps happening. It works. Studies on consumer behavior show that a well-crafted non-apology followed by a small goodwill gesture reduces complaint rates dramatically. People want to feel heard more than they want accountability. Companies figured this out a long time ago, and they have been using it ever since. But there is a cost. Not the kind that shows up immediately, but the kind that compounds quietly over time. Every non-apology trains the organization to avoid truth. Every cover avoids a lesson. Every deflection makes the next mistake more likely, because the company never actually processed what went wrong in the first place. This is what organizational psychologists call single-loop learning versus double-loop learning. Single-loop learning fixes the surface problem. Double-loop learning asks why the problem happened at all. Companies that never admit fault are permanently stuck in single-loop learning. They patch the symptom and walk away without ever examining the root. Think about what that means at scale. A company with 10,000 employees that consistently avoids accountability is an organization where nobody at any level feels safe raising a real problem. Because if the company never admits fault externally, it certainly never admits fault internally. The culture of denial goes all the way down. This connects to a psychological concept called psychological safety, developed by Harvard researcher Amy Edmondson. Her research showed that teams perform better when people feel safe to speak up about problems without fear of punishment. Companies that never admit they are wrong create environments where psychological safety is essentially zero. Mistakes get hidden, not surfaced. And here is what makes it a trap. Once a company has gone years without genuine accountability, the stakes for admitting fault become astronomically high. Because admitting one thing would invite scrutiny of everything. The company is not just protecting a single mistake, it is protecting a pattern. And that pattern, if examined, could be catastrophic. This is why lawyers become so central to how large corporations communicate. Every public statement goes through legal review, not to make sure it is honest, but to make sure it cannot be used as evidence. The language becomes increasingly precise and increasingly hollow. Clarity is the enemy. Vagueness is the protection. There is a term for this in legal circles called the litigation hold mentality. When companies operate under constant threat of lawsuits, all internal communication gets filtered through the question of how this would look in court. What starts as a legal precaution eventually becomes the default mode of all company communication, including the humankind. This is where something truly strange happens to the people inside these organizations. Over time, they begin to genuinely believe the company narrative. It is not just that they are told to say certain things, they actually internalize the story. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, and it is incredibly powerful once it takes hold in a culture. Motivated reasoning means you start with a conclusion and work backwards to find evidence that supports it. A company that believes it is fundamentally good and well-intentioned will find endless ways to interpret its own actions charitably. The employee who raises concerns becomes a troublemaker. The customer who complains becomes unreasonable. The journalist who investigates becomes an enemy. And now you can see the full picture beginning to form. This is not just about PR strategies or legal maneuvering. This is about a deep psychological architecture that companies build over time. An architecture designed to protect the self-image of the institution at all costs, even at the cost of truth, even at the cost of people. Let us now look at what the internal mechanics of this actually look like at the ground level. Because understanding the psychology of denial is one thing, but seeing how it operates day to day inside a real organization reveals just how normalized this behavior becomes for the people living inside it. Imagine you are a mid-level manager at a large company. A product your team worked on is causing problems for customers. You know it, your team knows it, but the product was a high-profile launch that the CEO championed. What do? This is the moment the culture reveals itself. In a healthy culture, you escalate the problem. You document it, you propose a fix, and leadership thanks you for catching it early. In a culture of denial, escalating the problem makes you the problem. You are seen as negative, as not being a team player, as threatening the narrative that the launch was a success. This is what researchers call the shooting the messenger dynamic. It has been documented in organizations across every industry and every country. When leaders respond to bad news with frustration instead of curiosity, they train everyone below them to stop bringing bad news. And that is when the company starts operating in a reality that no longer exists. There is a famous concept that captures this perfectly. It is called the Abilene Paradox, named after a thought experiment by management researcher Jerry Harvey. In it, a group of people all privately agree that a plan is bad, but because nobody wants to be the one to say so, they all go along with it, and everybody suffers. The Abilene paradox is not an occasional failure in organizations. For companies built on denial, it is the operating norm. Entire strategy meetings get held, where everyone in the room knows the direction is wrong, but the culture makes honesty more dangerous than silence. And so the wrong direction gets more resources and more momentum. Now let us talk about something that sits underneath all of this and gives it its real power. Status. In most large organizations, admitting you are wrong carries a significant status cost. You lose credibility, you invite criticism, you signal weakness. And in a hierarchical environment, weakness invites predators. So people protect themselves by protecting their positions. This status protection scales all the way to the top. Executives at the senior level have even more to lose from admissions of error. Their entire compensation, their board relationships, and their professional legacy are tied to the story that they led the company well. Admitting a serious mistake would not just embarrass them, it would rewrite their whole narrative. And so you get what researchers call the echo chamber at the top. Senior leadership surrounds itself with people who reflect their views back to them. Dissenters get managed out quietly. Loyalists get promoted. And over time, the information that reaches the top is so filtered, so polished, and so carefully curated that the leaders genuinely do not know what is happening below them. This is a phenomenon known as information asymmetry within organizations. The people closest to the problems have the most accurate picture. The people with the most power to fix problems have the least accurate picture. And the gap between those two realities is filled entirely by people whose job is to manage upward rather than tell the truth upward. Let us shift now to how this psychology interacts with the outside world. Because companies do not just manage denial internally, they actively project it outward in ways that shape how the public perceives accountability. And the tools they use have become extraordinarily sophisticated over the past several decades. One of the most powerful tools is what communications theorists call narrative control. The company that speaks first and speaks loudest shapes how an event is remembered. When something goes wrong, the company that moves quickly to define the story gets to decide what the story is about. And they always make sure the story is not about their fault. You see this in corporate press releases all the time. The language is designed to center the company as a caring actor working hard to resolve a situation rather than as the cause of the situation. Every sentence is engineered to generate sympathy and distance simultaneously, to make you feel like the company is on your side, even when it is the one that hurt you. There is a psychological principle behind why this works, called the framing effect. How a situation is described dramatically changes how it is perceived, even when the underlying facts are identical. Companies invest enormous resources in framing because they know that the way a story is told matters far more to public perception than what actually happened. Think about the difference between a company saying we identified a defect and immediately issued a recall, versus a company saying after receiving some customer concerns, we are proactively investigating to ensure the highest standards. Both sentences might describe the same situation, but they create entirely different impressions. One sounds proactive, one sounds reactive, one sounds responsible, one sounds evasive. The company always chooses the first version. This language engineering extends into something even more calculated, called strategic ambiguity. Companies learn to communicate in a way that appears to say something while actually committing to nothing. It keeps options open, it avoids creating a record of specific promises, and it allows the company to later claim they never said what everyone understood them to be saying. The use of strategic ambiguity is so widespread in corporate communication that most consumers have stopped expecting clarity from companies entirely. We have been conditioned to accept vague reassurances as normal. We have stopped asking follow-up questions because we know they will not be answered honestly. This normalization of corporate doublespeak is itself a psychological achievement for the companies that practice it. Now here is something that surprises most people when they first hear it. Research shows that companies that refuse to admit wrongdoing actually perform better financially in the short term than companies that do admit it. This seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you understand the mechanics of how markets process accountability. When a company admits fault, it triggers a predictable cascade. Stock price drops, legal claims increase, Regulators pay attention. Media scrutiny intensifies. Partners get nervous. All of this is measurable and immediate. The cost of honesty arrives on a specific day at a specific dollar value. The cost of dishonesty, by contrast, is diffuse, delayed, and harder to trace back to the original decision. This is what behavioral economists call hyperbolic discounting. Humans and human organizations consistently prefer smaller immediate rewards over larger delayed rewards. Or in reverse, they prefer to delay pain even when delaying it makes the pain larger. Companies are no different. The short-term cost of admission is visible. The long-term cost of denial is invisible. So they choose denial every time. But here is where the psychology becomes truly fascinating. The same companies that masterfully avoid accountability externally often experience a kind of internal reckoning that they never see coming. Because denial does not just affect the public relationship. It fundamentally changes the inner life of the organization in ways that eventually become impossible to manage. This internal reckoning shows up first in what organizational psychologists call identity fragmentation. The company tells the public one story. The employees know a different story. And over time, the gap between those two versions of reality creates a kind of institutional cognitive dissonance that makes it increasingly difficult for the organization to function coherently. Employees who know the truth, but are required to perform the fiction, start to experience something called moral injury. This is a term borrowed from military psychology that describes the damage done to a person's sense of integrity when they are required to act against their own values. It is not the same as stress. It is deeper, and it is harder to heal. Moral injury inside organizations manifests as cynicism, disengagement, and quiet resignation. The employee who once cared deeply about doing good work stops caring. Not because they are lazy, but because they have learned that good work is not what is rewarded. What is rewarded is loyalty to the narrative, and that knowledge hollows out their relationship with the job entirely. This is why companies that never admit fault consistently struggle with employee retention and engagement even when they pay well. People do not leave jobs because of money alone. They leave because of meaning. And when the meaning of their work is contaminated by a culture that requires them to look away from the truth, no salary can compensate for that loss. Now let us bring in a third concept that ties together everything we have talked about so far. It is called narcissistic organizational culture, and it was developed by psychoanalyst and organizational theorist Michael Mokoby. His work showed that some organizations develop a collective psychology that mirrors the traits of narcissistic personality disorder in individuals. A narcissistic organization shares striking traits with a narcissistic person. It has an inflated sense of its own importance. It requires constant external validation. It reacts to criticism with disproportionate aggression. It exploits relationships without acknowledging the exploitation. And critically, it is constitutionally incapable of genuine self-reflection because self-reflection would require acknowledging imperfection. Mokoby pointed out something important about how narcissistic organizations attract followers. Their confidence is magnetic. Their certainty is reassuring. When a company presents itself as unquestionably right, unquestionably superior, and unquestionably good, people want to believe it. It feels stable. It feels safe. And so the culture perpetuates itself because everyone wants to be on the winning team. But there is a specific kind of crisis that narcissistic organizations are uniquely terrible at handling. Mokoby called it the narcissistic injury. This is when reality intrudes so forcefully that the false self-image can no longer be sustained. For companies, this moment usually comes in the form of a scandal so large that narrative management cannot contain it. When a narcissistic organization experiences a narcissistic injury, the response is almost always the same. Instead of genuine reflection, there is a massive intensification of denial. The attack on the company is reframed as an attack from external enemies. Whistleblowers become traitors. Journalists become activists. Regulators become political operatives. Everyone who threatens the story becomes part of a conspiracy against the company. You have seen this happen in real time with major companies across multiple industries. The pattern is so consistent that once you know what to look for, you cannot unsee it. The more credible the accusation, the more extreme the denial. The more evidence that accumulates, the more aggressively the company attacks the credibility of those presenting it. And here is what makes this phase so dangerous. not just for the public, but for the company itself. Because in the intensification of denial, the company begins to make increasingly desperate moves. It overreaches legally, it alienates allies, it pushes key employees past their limit. The very defense mechanisms meant to protect the company start accelerating its unraveling. This is what psychologists call the paradox of control. When a system feels its control slipping, it does not relax and adapt, it tightens. And tightening in a system under pressure does not restore control, it creates brittleness. The company that might have survived a modest admission of fault in year 1 often cannot survive the avalanche of revelations that accumulates by year 5. There is a famous phrase that captures this perfectly. It is not the crime, it is the cover-up. This saying exists because it describes a pattern so consistent across organizations and individuals that it has become practically a law of institutional behavior. The original mistake is rarely fatal. The refusal to acknowledge it almost always is. But let us not get so caught up in the dramatic collapses that we miss what happens in the far more common scenario, where the company never fully collapses, where it sustains the denial indefinitely, where the accountability never quite arrives. Because for every spectacular corporate downfall, there are hundreds of companies that manage to avoid accountability for decades without ever paying a visible price. What does it look like inside those companies? What does a culture of permanent denial produce in the long run when it is never disrupted from outside? The answer is a particular kind of organizational deterioration that is slow, quiet, and almost invisible until suddenly it is not. The first thing that happens is the gradual exit of integrity. This is not dramatic. There is no single moment when all the honest people leave at once. It happens one by one over years. A person with high personal standards joins the company excited and optimistic. They raise a concern. It is dismissed. They raise another. They are managed. Eventually they leave quietly for somewhere that will listen. The people who stay are not necessarily dishonest, but they are selected over time for a specific trait, which is the ability to tolerate the gap between what is said and what is true. Organizations call this pragmatism. They call it being a team player. What it actually is the slow erosion of the capacity for honest feedback anywhere in the system. As the honest people exit and the pragmatists consolidate, the organization develops what researchers call a competence trap. It gets extremely good at the things that sustain the current story, but loses the ability to do the things that would require changing it. Innovation slows, risk tolerance shrinks, and the company becomes increasingly focused on protecting what it has rather than building what it could become. This competence trap is one of the most underappreciated forms of long-term corporate damage caused by denial culture. Because it does not show up as a scandal, it shows up as stagnation. The company that was once a leader slowly becomes a follower. The products become less interesting. The talent becomes less exceptional, and the people inside point to market forces when the real cause is the culture they live in. Now here is where we need to bring in the customer, because all of this internal psychology eventually shapes the external relationship. And the customer experience of a company that never admits fault has a very specific texture that most people recognize, even if they cannot name it. When you call a company that has a denial culture with a genuine complaint, you are not speaking to a person trying to help you. You are speaking to a person trained to protect the company from you. Every response is filtered through the question of what can we give this person that makes them go away without us admitting anything. Customer service in these companies is not service, it is containment. And customers feel this even when they cannot articulate it. There is a quality of being managed rather than heard, of being offered a solution before the problem has been acknowledged, of being thanked for your patience when what you need is an honest conversation. This feeling, repeated enough times, produces a specific emotional response in customers, which researchers call learned helplessness. Learned helplessness was first described by psychologist Martin Seligman in experiments that showed that when animals were repeatedly placed in situations where their actions had no effect on outcomes, they eventually stopped trying even when the situation changed and their actions could have helped them. Customers of companies that never admit fault develop the same response. They stop expecting change. They stop complaining. They just silently leave or silently stay and resent. The silent staying is particularly interesting from a business psychology perspective. Many companies interpret low complaint rates as evidence that customers are satisfied. But in a denial culture, low complaint rates often mean that customers have simply given up on being heard. The company is getting a false positive signal that reinforces the denial culture further. The silence reads as approval when it is actually resignation. This brings us to one of the most counterintuitive findings in customer psychology research. Companies that apologize genuinely and take real accountability after a failure often end up with stronger customer loyalty than companies that never experienced a failure at all. Researchers call this the service recovery paradox. A real apology and a real fix can actually deepen trust more than a flawless experience. The logic makes sense when you think about it from a human perspective. We do not expect perfection from the people we trust. We expect honesty. When someone we respect makes a mistake and owns it fully, it actually increases our confidence in them. Because now we know that they will tell us the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. And that is what real trust is built on. But companies that have built their entire identity around being perfect cannot access this paradox, because accessing it requires first admitting imperfection. And their entire psychological architecture is built to prevent exactly that. So they are locked out of one of the most powerful trust-building tools available to them by the very strategy they use to protect their trust. Let us now talk about what happens when these companies do eventually face a genuine reckoning. Not a minor controversy managed with a careful press release, but the real thing, the kind that cannot be contained. What does the psychology of the organization look like in those moments, and why do so many of them still get it wrong even then? The first thing that happens when a real reckoning arrives is a phenomenon called bunker mentality. The leadership circle shrinks. Communication with the outside world gets tighter and more controlled. Decisions get made by a smaller group with less information and more fear. And the company starts operating not like a business, but like a besieged fortress. Every external inquiry becomes a threat. Every internal concern becomes a security risk. Bunker mentality is psychologically understandable. When a system is under attack, consolidating and defending is a natural survival response. But it is catastrophically counterproductive for a company in a genuine reckoning, because the reckoning is not external, it is internal. The problem is not coming from outside. It is rooted in decisions made inside, and you cannot defend yourself from a threat that originated within your own walls. What the company needs at this moment is the exact opposite of what bunker mentality produces. It needs radical transparency, expanded communication, genuine acknowledgement of harm, real engagement with the people affected. But these are the very things that decades of denial culture have made psychologically impossible for the organization to do. The muscles required for accountability have atrophied completely from disuse. This is what researchers call an institutional competency gap. The company never developed the organizational capacity for genuine accountability because it never needed to in the short term. And by the time the need arrives, the capacity is gone. Leadership genuinely does not know how to do it, not because they are villains, but because the skill was never practiced, modeled, or rewarded in their world. There is something almost tragic about this when you examine it closely. At the moment when genuine accountability could save the company, save its reputation, even save the careers of its leaders, the accumulated psychological weight of decades of denial makes it functionally impossible to take that step. The company was never preparing for this moment. It was always preparing for the moment to never arrive. And so we often see what communications researchers call the too little, too late response. The company finally admits something, but it admits the minimum necessary rather than the full truth. It acknowledges the symptoms rather than the cause. It expresses regret without expressing responsibility. And the public, having waited so long for honesty and now receiving a partial version of it, feels more betrayed than they would have felt by continued silence. The partial admission is its own form of psychological damage to the relationship, because it signals that the company is still calculating rather than genuinely owning. It shows that even now the primary concern is not the harm done to people, but the management of consequences. And people are exquisitely sensitive to that distinction. They can feel the difference between an organization reckoning with itself and an organization performing a reckoning. Now let us zoom out from the specific mechanics of denial and look at the broader cultural question. Because the companies we have been describing do not exist in isolation. They exist within markets, within societies, within cultural norms that either enable or challenge the psychology of non-accountability. And understanding that broader context reveals something important about how change actually happens. For most of the 20th century, the structures that enabled corporate non-accountability were firmly in place. Information moved slowly. Investigative journalism required enormous resources. Consumer organizing was difficult and geographically limited. Legal remedies were expensive and slow. And the average person who felt wronged by a company had almost no mechanism for making their experience part of the public record. This information asymmetry was the oxygen that kept the denial culture alive. Companies could maintain their narrative not because their narrative was convincing, but because the alternative narrative had no platform. The customer who knew the truth could tell maybe 100 people at most. The company that wanted to control the story could tell millions. There was simply no competition. And then something shifted. Not overnight and not completely, but in ways that have gradually and irreversibly changed the relationship between corporate narrative and public reality. The mechanisms that allowed information asymmetry to protect non-accountability began to erode, and the psychology of companies that never admit fault started to become a more costly identity to maintain. The shift did not come from regulation alone. Regulatory cycles are slow and often captured by the industries they are meant to regulate. It did not come from journalism alone. Resources for investigative reporting have shrunk significantly over the same period. The shift came from something that changed the fundamental physics of information itself. The cost of sharing experience dropped to essentially zero. When the cost of sharing experience drops to zero, the information asymmetry that protected corporate denial collapses. One customer's experience can now reach 10 million people overnight. Internal documents can be shared instantly with the world. Employee experiences that used to stay locked inside the walls of a company can now be read by anyone considering working there. The playing field is still not equal, but it is far less unequal than it used to be. And companies that built their entire psychology around the assumption of information asymmetry are finding that the foundation of their denial culture is dissolving underneath them. The strategy that worked for decades does not work the same way anymore. And because the strategy is not just a communication choice, but a deep psychological orientation, changing it requires far more than updating the PR playbook. This is creating a new kind of corporate identity crisis. Companies that have never built genuine accountability into their psychology now find themselves in environments where accountability is increasingly demanded and increasingly visible when absent, and they are responding in the only way their psychology allows. They are adapting the performance of accountability without developing the reality of it. This performance takes many forms. Detailed corporate responsibility reports that quantify charitable activities while leaving core business practices unchanged. Carefully scripted apology tours by executives that hit all the emotional notes of genuine contrition without admitting specific wrongdoing. Public commitments to change that are announced with great fanfare and quietly abandoned when attention moves elsewhere. The form of accountability without its substance. Researchers who study this phenomenon call it accountability washing, a term borrowed from the more familiar concept of greenwashing. The company adopts the visual and verbal language of accountability to satisfy the social demand for it, without actually restructuring the behaviors and incentives that produce the problems accountability is supposed to address. It is denial wearing the costume of honesty. But here is the critical question that brings us toward the end of this story. Is there a version of this that ends differently? Are there companies that broke this pattern, that built genuine cultures of accountability from the inside out, rather than performing it from the outside in? And if so, what made them different, and what does that tell us about what is actually possible? The answer is yes, those companies do exist. And what made them different was almost never a single dramatic decision at the top. What made them different was a sustained and deliberate investment in what researchers call psychological safety at every level of the organization. Creating environments where the honest conversation was not just permitted, but actively rewarded. Where bringing bad news was a career asset rather than a career liability. The companies that built genuine accountability cultures did something specific in their incentive structures. They separated the messenger from the message. A person who surfaced a problem was evaluated on the quality of their observation and the courage it took to raise it, not on whether the problem reflected badly on the team or the leadership. This single structural change rewired the entire information flow of the organization. They also did something psychologically sophisticated with how failure was discussed internally. Rather than treating mistakes as events to be managed, they treated them as data to be analyzed. Failures became case studies rather than scandals. The question was never who did this wrong, but what in our system made this outcome possible. Removing the personal threat from the analysis made honest analysis possible for the first time. And externally, these companies discovered what the service recovery paradox predicted: that owning mistakes fully and specifically built deeper loyalty than maintaining an image of perfection. Customers who saw a genuine response to failure became advocates in a way that satisfied customers never quite became. The honesty became a differentiator, something genuinely rare in their market, and people rewarded it because it was real. What this tells us is that the psychology of never admitting fault is not inevitable. It is a choice, a compounding series of choices made at every level of an organization over years and decades. Each individual choice seems small, choosing the careful statement over the honest one, choosing to promote the loyalist over the truth-teller, choosing to contain the story rather than address its cause. But each choice narrows the options available the next time. And in reverse, each choice toward honesty opens options, not immediately and not without cost. Genuine accountability is uncomfortable and expensive in the short term. It invites scrutiny. It requires vulnerability. It demands that people in power say publicly what they know privately. But each honest choice makes the next honest choice easier. The culture shifts gradually and then suddenly, and what was once impossible becomes the new normal. So the next time you watch a company release a statement that says everything except what it needs to say, you will understand what you are actually looking at. Not incompetence, not bad luck, but a psychological architecture built over time by thousands of small decisions to protect the story rather than tell it. An institution that learned to confuse its narrative with its identity and now cannot separate the two. The companies that never admit they were wrong are not outliers. They are the product of systems that reward protection over honesty at every level. The real question is not why so many companies operate this way. The real question is whether we as customers, as employees, and as a society have decided to stop making that psychology profitable. Because until we do, it will keep working exactly as designed.